Bill Henshall here again for the Constitutional Crisis channel. This will be the first of two short and relatively related videos, because there are some that think what I do and what I've advocated, especially on the prior 80-odd videos here, that there's a lot of racist overtones to it. There isn't. There may be a lot of racial overtones, no question about that, but that's because, my in-depth studies of the Constitution, history, and laws of the United States have now established that 14th Amendment doesn't exist, and it never did. If that's the case, then that citizenship also doesn't exist. But there's a lot of good news in this message at one and the same time, because if we get back to the laws the way they were prior to the war between the states, and people are going to say, oh my God, white supremacist, neo-Nazi. No. These are the laws the way they were when we had a government of defined and limited powers based on the rule of law and the consent of the governed. That's a hell of a lot better than what has followed. And even if we might concede on the one hand there have been some quote-unquote gains made to certain insular minorities here and there, the cost is far too great. Because we've given up our Constitution and our states in the bargain, and that's not how we're supposed to be doing business here. That's not how the framers set it up. So that said, one of my goals here is to get the 14th Amendment officially off the books. I consider it to be off the books, but get it officially off the books, out of here. We can then go back to square one and create some much more effective and realistic ways to handle things here. And a lot of that comes, by the way, from if we go back to that all people will have the right to invoke each and every provision of the Constitution in order to assert rights. And I would much rather personally go into court, for example, and make the argument that a given law is a bill of attainder, the taking of property without judicial process. And all of them qualify as that these days because we have nobody in office that's qualified to lawfully hold the positions they claim to have. That's a hell of a lot better argument than civil rights is. Trust me. So if we do that, we then have to come to grips, with the issue of, well, without the 14th Amendment citizenship and good riddance, what status and standing do other people have? Well, that's not an easy issue to resolve, but I would suggest that we could pass temporary measures, perhaps even in Congress if we get qualified people in there. So that we have a period of waiting or anticipation to see what's going to happen, and let most of the people that are here stay here, with certain exceptions, that have by their own actions or by the declarations of de facto state of war, we've determined that they shouldn't be here. I'm speaking here specifically about Muslims, but there may be others that qualify in this area too. And just like with Korematsu and the Japanese in World War II, and I'm not in love with the fact that they were interned the way they were, but I think the choices there were very limited. And I'm not a big one for agreeing with Franklin Roosevelt about anything, but this is one area that, given the facts of the Korematsu case, they did right. I think his attorneys could have asked some hell of a lot better questions than they did. But they didn't, and the court ruled on what it was asked to rule on. That's how they work there, right or wrong, or good or bad. And I reiterate here, and I mentioned it in other videos about this, that was 1944. 4 years later, the court decides in the case of Takahashi versus California Coastal Commission. You can check that one out in the notes below. 4 years later, the Japanese aren't citizens. Well, if they weren't citizens then, they sure as hell weren't in 1944. So why is Korematsu's case even in the Supreme Court? And it's how silly this gets at times. But that said, I go back to the common law, a lot of which does, in fact, have its roots in the Old Testament and the 12 tribes of Israel. And, of course, there was a strict prohibition against the mixing of the tribes. You just didn't do it. That's not how it worked. And you check your citizenship laws these days in a lot of nations. Japan springs immediately to mind, as does Israel and China. And you check your laws and see if you want to immigrate to that country, whether you'll even be allowed to do it, let alone become a full citizen, the equivalent of the natives to which those nations were created. You're not going to find it. And I say what works there, there's no reason why it could not and should not work perfectly well here in a political sense. So there'll be political rights that maybe some groups don't have. But there's a process that has to be engaged in order to decide all this, and decided in accordance with Article 5. If that happens, whatever results is a good thing. So that said, I do feel like, if we don't assert ourselves as lawful, de jure, free white state citizens, that nobody else has a hope in hell, because we have the Creator endowed inalienable rights that the framers of the Constitution recognized, and the powers that be will be obliged to recognize today. Thank you.